Welcome to part 4 of this series on fighting misinformation. In this part 4 of our videos, we're going to talk about the very practical strategies you can take for evaluating the sources that you find online. This will be followed immediately in the same video by part 5, which is all about media bias and trust. So let's begin this part now. Okay, here's what you'll learn in part 4 of this video. How to be a critical news media reader, how to be your own fact checker, how to evaluate the news, specifically getting tips from journalists themselves, and then how to identify what I'll call data danger zones, where you have to be particularly careful. So, of course, evaluating information online or anywhere is certainly not a new problem, but there are some very current challenges that are making this particularly difficult. So, what are they? First of all, we're in an environment now where facts and opinions and unsupported assertions are all combined together, making it really much more difficult to determine what to believe. There's been a decline in trust of experts and expertise. And there's a whole range of purveyors of disinformation and misinformation, bad actors. And there's multiple types and strategies and approaches. I came across a chart that I thought did a very good job of showing the range of these bad actors, specifically when it comes to COVID disinformation. This is put together by the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And let me just show you here. So you can see in this chart, you've got everything from companies and their competitors, political and social groups, nation states, fraudsters and pranksters. They have different objectives. They have different methods for fooling people, different levels of sophistication. So you can see we're up against a whole range of different bad actors, and that makes things more difficult and confusing. And a part of all of this is a quotation I like very much by Claire Wardle, who's with First Draft News. She has said, the most effective disinformation contains a kernel of truth. So somebody can pull on that and really go from there. So there's really two major problems to address when we're talking about disinformation here. There's what I might call the outside world, and those are the external forces that are kind of working to get you to believe something that's not true. But then there's also the internal forces, what you bring to information coming from your own mind, your own head, in a sense. So let's start with the external forces first, talking about that. And we have already talked about in one of the earlier videos, the role of algorithms as a concerning external force. But there's also humans, there's people that are causing us problems. So let's talk about that. So the late Senator Daniel Moynihan once famously said, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. And we're living in a time where we find, and not just online, but in speeches and in all sorts of sources and media and variety on broadcast television, there's a trend where someone will make an unproven assertion, just state something as if it was a fact. All right, and that makes things really difficult. And what's really even strange about this in particular is that even people who are conspiracy theorists, who have sometimes very outlandish theories about things, are kind of lowering their own bar to this. In the past, it used to be that conspiracy theorists would point to strange coincidences or link different events together and say, I see what's really going on. But now even conspiracy theorists will just state their belief as a fact, as if it was true. There's a really interesting book that covers this called A Lot of People Are Saying by a psychologist and another scholar, The New Conspiracism and the Assault on Democracy. But facts, they do exist. And as Mark Twain called, they're stubborn things because they do exist. Okay, so let's talk about differences between facts and some other information you might come across. Let's look at a sold out political rally, for example. So let's say there was a sold out political rally. So a fact there in describing it could be our stadium downtown holds 2,000 people and it was sold out at last week's political rally. Why is this factual or considered a fact? Well, it is because that claim can be confirmed and checked. We can look at pictures of the stadium or talk to the manager to find out how many tickets were sold and so forth. Then maybe someone else will say, since the stadium was full, the speaker really knows how to rally the community support. That's an interpretation of that fact. Is it true? Is it logical? Maybe it's an interpretation, though, of the fact. Another statement about that rally might be the attendees at that rally did not seem too enthusiastic about the speaker. Okay, that's an opinion. Well, what do others think? Do they agree? And also, is this opinion an informed or expert opinion, someone who studies this thing, or analysis, or just a person's opinion? They might be right, they might be wrong, but it's an opinion and not a fact, unlike the first point. Then finally, there's that disinformation or outright lie. If somebody then described it as something like, everybody knows that nobody showed up at that rally, it was a complete flop. All right. I mean, if we had evidence that it was sold out, then obviously stating something as a fact that can be variably be shown as proven or as false is misinformation or disinformation, depending on the intention. So there are fact checking strategies that you can take. So let's go over a few of those. And in fact, you can employ some of the same techniques and strategies that many of the most well-known of the fact-checking sites employ themselves. You've probably come across Snopes and PolitiFact, that when there's a claim going around online, they will actually do the research and let you know, if you go to their site, whether this popular claim is true or not. So let's talk about what you can do here. So a lot of what these sites do is something you can do, and you can engage in what's called lateral reading. And what lateral reading is, basically just reading across the web. So you've got a particular claim that you're wondering about, somebody states something, you just really put it into Google, and then just start reading how else it is being claimed, how that claim is being covered or analyzed in other sources, particularly more standard news sources like a Newswire or a New York Times or a BBC or a standard news source that you might come across, or others. But just start looking at where it's being covered, and is it being confirmed? Is it being debunked? Or, as often the case, more complicated? There's maybe partially true, that kernel of truth, for example. So you can really learn more about that claim. And this is really what you're doing here is following one of the main principles of what we might call as journalism 101, not relying on a single source. All right, you're doing your own research here in a good way. And isn't this just a Google search? Yeah, pretty much, except it's a little more too. First of all, your mindset and intention. It's very focused, and you're closely examining your sources as you're going along here. Now, I do need to bring up one caution with this lateral reading approach for fact checking something that you've come across. If that claim is very, very new, like it just came out in the last couple of days or day, you may only find the misinformation or disinformation, assuming it's a false claim, because the sources that would normally write about it, conventional information source and journalistic sources, have not yet had a chance to do the research and to write about it. So if it's really new, you have to be very careful. You might come across just a claim and those that are repeating that claim. So be a little cautious there. So what are some other good journalism 101 tips that you can follow to be your own fact checker? As I just said before, don't rely on a single source. Always get a few to confirm it. They maybe just have more subtleties about the topic that you'll want to know about. If a certain document or data or survey is quoted in a particular or discussed in a particular article you're reading online, if there's a link to it, look at it yourself, or just search on the name of that document or survey or whatever, and look at it yourself. Very often, context and the subtleties and complexities of something are gone or misinterpreted. So look at it yourself. That's what journalists will do. Google, of course, the author or institution behind it, learn a little bit more about them. Is there an agenda? What is their credibility and experience in this, and so forth? Sometimes you can actually send an email or send a social media message to the writer or the creator of the information. Ask your own questions. You may or may not get a response, but sometimes you might get lucky, and that can help you get a better sense and determine how much validity you want to put into that particular claim. Also, I will say beware of certain data danger zones, in a sense, areas that you're most likely to be led astray. And those are breaking news, something that just happened, like in the last hour, a couple hours. Very often, even the best journalists will get conflicting information and are not quite sure what has happened yet, often in natural disasters, or it could be a shooting, something along those lines. Anything that's an appeal to anger and fear, if it's some content that makes you really upset, you have to be careful about. We're going to talk about that in particular, about avoiding being triggered in the final video, video 6 on mindfulness. Always be really careful about anonymous sources. They're not accountable at all for what they say. And also look out for bad science. And if we're talking about science, it's very important to have just even a rudimentary understanding of what we mean when we talk about scientific consensus. So scientific consensus, I like this chart kind of in a nutshell. Basically, it's the collective opinion and judgment of scientists in a particular field of study. It's a general agreement. The theory has become fact, supported by overwhelming evidence and well accepted. What it is not, it's not just a bunch of scientists with the same opinion. And it also does not mean that no more research is needed and is the end of the discussion. Now, scientific consensus can take decades to really emerge. And there's a long process, as you can see in this chart, about how scientific consensus evolves. One of the reasons we're all having so much trouble with trying to understand what seems like, reversals or changes in advice on COVID is because we're actually seeing, we normally don't see this, the scientific process and consensus method play out in real time. And we're not kind of used to that. So that's one, maybe not the only reason, but one of the main reasons that there's confusion around the different advice we've gotten about COVID. But we are seeing scientific consensus emerge. So now let's talk about those internal forces. Those are some key external forces. That's how do you approach the news? And let's talk about some of the challenges here. So some of those internal forces are what you bring to it. We all these days skim headlines and news feeds and the video clips. We're looking at them very quickly. That can give us a very superficial understanding of the complexities behind something. And it can be very distracting as well. We also bring to it what's called generally now motivated reasoning. We want to believe something. This is similar, though not precisely the same thing as confirmation bias, where you find information that confirms what you already believe. This is where you really want and you bring to it, you're kind of set, almost like I did in video 1 with where I was misled by that false quote by Donald Trump, motivated reasoning. There are also a lot of interesting psychological explanations of why we believe something. And that's going to be discussed actually in video 6 on mindfulness. So the bottom line here is we're scanning, we're skimming. A lot of these things we're scanning and skimming are questionable assertions. We're not getting complexity. They're promoted by algorithms. It's all fueled by motivated reasoning. So we're in a difficult situation. So here are a few strategies for changing your news reading habits so they can be more effective. So one is to take those active fact-checking strategies that we just went over. Another is to be what we can call a critical news reader and viewer. So how do you do that? First, you just never assume automatically what your reader here is true, okay? You read carefully and slowly, particularly when something is very important to you for whatever reason. Don't do it quickly. And then develop what I would call 3 habits of mind. One is suspending judgment, and we'll go over each of these separately. Another is applying probability. And the third is developing what I'll call your JDLR intuition. We'll get into that in a second. So that first habit of mind is suspending judgment. What does that mean? So what that really means is as you're researching or reading about something and that is something you're trying to learn about, you're absorbing it, you're going to remember it, but hold off on making a conclusion too early. Just keep reading, put the pieces together as you continue gathering information, whether it's in notes or in your mind or a combination. Notice things that reinforce something else, trends that are developing a little bit, what contradicts, what's making sense. Look for your own developing of new insights on this, that aha moment. Now I get it, okay? And you're utilizing good sources here when you're doing this process, okay? All right, and that's suspending judgment. You wait until things click, all right, and then make a decision. The second habit of mine is probability, all right? So what is probability in this context? It's basically what is most likely to be true. We're not always going to feel 100% sure that this is the answer, okay? And the renowned sociologist and scholar Jacques Barzun, who is also author of the book The Modern Researcher, has said the historian arrives at truth through probability. He's writing for historians, but also researchers and scholars in general. What's most likely to be true? And through probability like that, you can eventually attain what famous journalist, Watergate journalist, as in Woodward Bernstein, Carl Bernstein calls the best obtainable version of the truth. That's what he always describes as what good journalists and good readers, in this case, can obtain, the best obtainable version of the truth. Okay. And finally, by applying these three practices, you can develop habit number 3. That's the JDLR factor. A colleague of mine once said that she, an experienced librarian and researcher, will look at something, and if it just doesn't look right, it deserves extra scrutiny. And you'll develop that over time as you become a good researcher, JDLR factor. Okay, that was part 4. We can move right now into part 5, which is about media bias and trust. I'm going to start by giving you a list of all of the trusted news sources right here. Okay, media bias and trust, here it is. There's your list. All right, there is no media source you can fully trust, all right? But at the same time, there are some that are better than others. And we can think about probability again to determine what of your media sources are more likely to be accurate and why. All right, let's talk about that. So here's some signs of what I would say could be a more trusted news source, I should say. First of all, if it's not ideological and its mission is primarily to inform, that why it was set up to inform. Now, there are some exceptions to this. You may, for example, or let's say what I may, for example, I often find good information coming from the Rachel Maddow show at MSNBC. I can't really say that's non-ideological, but the reason that I check myself, because I know I might have motivated reasoning to believe it, but the show employs really good investigative reporters and does a very good job of connecting the dots and drawing conclusions. So I try to check myself because I know I'm more likely to believe what I hear there. And there's been a couple times where I was skeptical, and I was right to be skeptical. So you have to have a little bit of a different lens on yourself. But in general, the non-ideological news source is a more likely one you can say you might decide is a trusted source. That's a whole good another conversation unto itself. The content of the source, it's fact-based. It's primarily determined by facts. It's well-researched. It cites evidence when there's a claim, doesn't just say something like in everything everybody is saying in video 4, and connects the dots. What really logically makes sense with some data, hard data and evidence. Signs of a trusted news source are staffed by trained journalists or experts in the field, someone that has experience and knows what they're talking about. Also, they have a proven track record. Things that this source has stated or covered as going on in the past has turned out to be accurate. They're also accountable for errors. So in other words, this is would lead you to look more to the larger well-known sources, even though they may have their own issues. But a larger well-known source, if they make a big mistake, they're going to have to acknowledge it, like a New York Times, for example. And so their editors and their journalists are extra careful often, not always, probability, because they know that if they make a mistake, they're going to be held to account for it. Somebody with a blog, they might be really good, they might be really smart, they might be a trusted source for other reasons, which we can talk about, but they're not necessarily so accountable as much. So accountability helps here. And ultimately, I think a sign of any good information source, news and otherwise, will lead you to that insight and understanding deeper questions. You really get a sense of you kind of understand what's going on here. A really good feature article, for example, can do this. All right. And these can serve as your own touchstones for, when you want to confirm something, you want to check something, you're going to go to a couple of your trusted news sources. I'm happy to share a few of my personal favorites right here. So here are a few of mine. The Economist magazine is one. PBS's NewsHour is another. The Atlantic magazine for longer form journalism, which I think is outstanding. And the Wall Street Journal, not the editorial page so much, which has a political perspective, but their investigative reporters do a great job. Actually, they've gotten better and better at it. Often it's on their front page. So you might wonder, what about like anecdotal or conversational type of information you come across online? It's not really news, but it's a person or persons stating something that they believe. So do you have to dismiss those completely? No, you don't. It's one of those, it depends. If it's something based on somebody's experience and observation, and you have a lot of reinforcement, like somebody's describing how they were able to recover from a bad leg injury by doing a certain exercise, and other people are supporting that, or it's an observation, they were at the scene of a natural disaster and they're describing it and others are reinforcing it. So this is not a standard news source, of course, but a good researcher, an information seeker, knows when to use what kind of source at what point. So you don't have to dismiss them. You would not rely on it necessarily for anything, school paper, for example, unless it's unusual. But it's an it depends situation. I just want to at least acknowledge that these anecdotal conversations, they still have value, okay, but they're a little unconventional. So everybody always talks about media bias. So when we talk about bias, what do we mean, and how should we think about that when we're using our sources? So there's one really good analysis that was done, put into a chart that I like to share. And it's called the Media Bias Chart. It's available from a group called ADFONTES. This is their most recent version. And what this chart does is places some of the most popular sources, everything from CNN and Fox News all the way to the New York Post and 60 Minutes and the Atlantic Magazine and others that are less well known, on a scale from horizontally politically left to politically right, and on a vertical scale from inaccurate, fabricated information to fact reporting. And you can find a source here and see where it's placed on the scale. There's a whole long detailed criteria about why certain sources are placed here. And this has been revised every year. And it's not the end all be all to this. They do a really good job, though, I think, a fair-minded job, because their mission is to do this. It's not based on an ideology, is to really try to help people understand where different sources fall actually, and fail. And if nothing else, it's a really good conversation starter. Do you believe that that, for example, Wall Street Journal should be slightly to the right and is considered mostly analysis and mix of fact reporting analysis? Do you feel that The Intercept should be skews pretty strong left and is also analysis, and so on? So this is a very good source. It's not the only one, but it's one that I've actually used in kind of teaching processes as well. So interestingly, let's talk about how new school students actually use news sources. What you, as a group, as a group of students, use and trust. I actually did a survey in the spring of 2021 of all. Actually, I had access to all 9,000 plus new school undergraduates. I sent a survey. And I'm going to just excerpt a little bit of the survey. I got over 900 responses, which was really good. And I'll show you just the responses to a couple of questions in a word cloud. So one of the questions was, what sources do you check most frequently for news to keep up with the world? So you can see, based on the size of the font, the New York Times was the biggest. There's also Twitter, NPR, BBC, CNN, YouTube, just social media in general, the Washington Post, Instagram. All right. And then another question that was asked, or 18 questions in total. What sources do you trust? Okay, not just ones that use, what are your like touchstones? That question specifically was, do you consider any of your sources as touchstones, ones you rely on as most credible and believable? And here, New York Times popped up again, but also Instagram was fairly high. Also, you could see Vice turned out pretty high, which is kind of interesting. Twitter turned out pretty high, Apple News, and again, YouTube, the Washington Post, MSNBC. So what if we informally review just these responses? There's a couple of good maybe lessons here. So what we find, first of all, that new school students' news is primarily mainstream, first of all, New York Times, CNN, BBC. It has an urban liberal sensibility, we might say, New York Times, NPR, BBC. Highly reliant on social media, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. I think if we did the survey today, let's say in late 2022, we'd likely find TikTok up here more in a higher usage pattern. It was there, but not that high, but it was still kind of just getting going in 2021. And also a bit edgy, I'd say. Sources like Reddit, Joe Rogan, Vice turn up high as well. So looking at that, at the way new school students are generally getting their news, or at least undergraduates at this point, we might think about, well, if you were a typical new school student, what would be a good news a supplement to add to your news reading and viewing diet? So you might, if to be fully informed, you might want to add some outlier or non-mainstream sources. You might want to find out what is middle and rural America reading and viewing to counter that urban sensibility a little bit. What are conservatives reading and viewing? And also, if you're relying a lot on social media and you might be missing complexity and nuance, you want to get some more maybe scholarly news sources or those that cover things deeply and not just in images and videos and short bursts of information. And all this supplementary news is not so much to change your mind, of course, but again, to be better informed, and a minimum to know what other people are reading and thinking so you can have a better understanding of your culture and politics at the time. You might learn some new things too that you didn't realize. You may change your mind, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's necessarily why you've got to add these other sources or why you should. All right. So actually, I have a couple of places you can go to find out where your own personal most consulted and trusted sources fit. Let me show you actually. The first is actually just a place I'd like to gather those of you who are watching this, your sources, and just get an overview of who of the people that are watching this video, what you like to use. And there's a Jamboard. We can put up little digital yellow sticky notes. If you go to that site, tinyurl.com/your news source, you can see what you and your colleagues are looking at right now as well. So I'd ask you to go there. It just takes a minute or two. It's kind of fun, actually. You can also take your news sources and go to the next URL, which is tinyurl.com, test your news. And you can use that media bias chart I showed you a couple slides ago, where each source is decided whether it's left or right and how factual or not factual it is. If you want to know where your sources land there, you can type in the source or sources you use, and you will see where on the chart your source lands. And that's kind of fun too. So I'd recommend doing that. What else can you do in this arena? So I'd say have conversations with smart people, all right? Talking, again, that's what journalists do. They talk to people, you have conversations, you ask your questions, all right? So it's great, obviously, and we've got great information coming at us online, but conversations with people that know something are always critical if you really want to get a full understanding of something. And consult and talk to information experts, people that know how information works. And really, the information expert profession are librarians. That's what they're trained in. That's what their whole mission is. Their mission and practice, when you think about it, when you ask them to recommend a source, it's not to get you to click on something. It's not to get your attention. It's not to figure out how to promote something. Their only mission is to get you what is going to work for you as the best possible information source. So really, all hail librarians. They're one of the last trusted sources, I think, institutionally and individually from a professional that we have. And I really highly recommend you utilize them and get to know your librarians and talk to them. All right. And finally, ultimate solutions, I'd say, would be to committing to being well informed, following some of these strategies we talked about today, and always keeping an open mind to understanding more and knowing how to balance being skeptical, but also going to a broad range of sources. And on that, broaden that news source diet of yours. Try to get as much different types of information as you can. Again, use those habits of mind, suspend your judgment, apply probability, but absorb, figure out, think about, come to your own decisions. And finally, the last point I'd like to say is avoid nihilism. Facts and fair news sources do exist. Don't get to the point where you get and say everything's the same. Can't believe anything. And it's very tempting to do that. And I could see why we would do that. But that's not a good way or a helpful way to approach your news sources or information sources. Thank you for participating in this videos 4 and 5. And now we'll go to our final video in this series, video 6 on mindfulness.